And while we're still on the subject of arrow functions, I would also like to cover default parameters that come with ES6, as well as gotchas when we're starting to use arrow functions. So how the default parameters would work? Well, we're gonna have two variables, John and Peter. Both of them are equal to string, and then we have two functions. One is gonna be say hi, and the second one is gonna be say hello. That is using the arrow function. And the reason why I wrote two functions, just so you understand that we can use default parameters with an old function declarations that we used already before, as well as the arrow functions. So we don't have to use them just with arrow functions. And if in our functions we're just console logging a parameter that we're passing in our case, that is going to be the person. If we don't pass in that person, we are going to get undefined. So if I have say hi, and if I don't pass in the parameter, of course, I'm console logging hi, but then I can see that I have in a console undefined because I haven't passed in my argument. Now, if I am passing the argument, so for the say hello, of course, I have hello, and then whatever argument that I'm passing in, everything works as expected. But how could we avoid the behavior where we have the undefined? Well, in ES6, we have something called default parameters, where when I'm setting up the parameter, I can write the equal sign and then whatever my default parameter is going to be. So in my case, I guess I'm going to go with Susan. So if I'm not passing in anything as my argument, then it's going to console log Susan. Why? Because that is my default parameter. So of course, right now in the console, what I see is hi, Susan. Now, also, please keep in mind, though, that if you're going to pass in the argument, it's going to take precedent over the default parameter. So if I'm going to try to do the same thing in my arrow function, but since I'm passing in my argument, of course, I'm print out my argument, not the default parameter. So default parameter is all going to be the case when we're not passing in the argument in a function. And in this case, I don't know, I'm going to go with Bob. So if the person is not there, I'm going to console the Bob, but since I'm passing in the Peter, of course, I have the Peter in the console. And in order to make this interesting, I'm going to delete the Peter, and then I'm going to have Bob in the console. And essentially, what default parameters allow you to do is have some kind of fallback when you're setting up the function. So let's imagine that your functionality depends that there is going to be some kind of argument. And of course, if the user, or I don't know, if the argument in general is not being passed in a function, your functionality might break. So in that case, at least you have a fallback where you're like, okay, you know what? I'm going to set up a default parameter. So if nothing gets passed in a function, my functionality is still going to work. And I also would like to cover the arrow function gotchas as far as hoisting. Now, remember, hoisting was the fact that I could call my function here on the top and it's still going to work if I'm passing in the say hi. However, it's not going to work with say hello. Just to show you that, I'm going to move my say hi to the top. I'm going to run it and check it out. Hi, Susan still is in a console. Why? Because of the hoisting. So I can call my function even before I have declared it. However, it's not going to work the same with an arrow function because we are assigning it to a variable. So I can just move it up, and I don't even need to move it all the way up to a top of my document. I can just move it up before I declared my function. And once we're going to run it, notice it's going to say on caught reference error, cannot access say hello before it was initialized. So be careful when you're working with arrow functions. Since you are assigning them to a variable, you need to make sure that they are declared before you call them.